Ursula worked her way slowly and carefully into the dense brush. She needed its cover to hide her body from the prey she now stalked. The problem was sound. She wasn't exactly dainty and needed to remain unnoticed. Birds would give away her position on sighting her, and for any success, she had to avoid spooking any of the local wildlife. It was surprising how good the birds' hearing was, and they loved to sing out to the world when she was around. The brush was thorny as hell, but she had had success here once before, so it was worth the discomfort. Slowly, she wormed her way in. She timed the bigger movements she needed to make with gusts of wind, so any movement looked natural. The pole she carried was not exactly making things any easier, but it was an essential part if she wanted to have any success. The river lapped under the bush's roots, and she found her feet wet, where she struggled for purchase. Finally, after about 5 minutes of painful exertion, she was in position. She waited and watched for any signs her position had been noticed. Everything seemed normal. The birds were still singing to each other, no alarm calls were sounding, and the unusual hum of insects by the river continued. She slowly and carefully extended the pole to the water's edge. The end of the pole had 3 squirrel tails tied onto the end of it. She began gently slapping the tails from side to side, mimicking a small animal in distress on the water's surface. She'd twist the pole one way, and then the opposite, keeping the splashing and strength of struggle proportionate. She had watched her father use this tactic when she was young. Patience was vital, which had taken her some time to master. The key was making sure you went unnoticed during that time, otherwise you caught nothing. All around the riverbanks were dense bushes and trees extending back into the thick forest. The river was the only break in this scene of greenery. 10 minutes had now gone by without a single bite. Ursula didn't give up, though. She maintained the illusion of the animal in trouble and remained patient. About 30 yards out, she noticed a swirl on the surface of the river. The water was slow here and deep. She tensed herself in readiness and kept the pretense going. She sensed a large, dark shape surface 15 yards out, dead ahead. It gently moved towards her position, picking up speed as it homed in on its prey. Ursula watched as the predator closed the distance. 15 yards, 10 yards, 5 yards. The water in front of her exploded as she felt the pole almost ripped out of her hands by formidable jaws. Rather than let go, her grip tightened. With legs firmly planted and braced against the roots, she yanked the pole. To her ensuing piece of bone she'd filed into a barb hit home. The prey thrashed even harder in panic, realizing its intended meal was not what it had hoped for. Firmly, she drew the pole in. Once close enough, she let it go with one hand and brought her arm up over her head in a sweeping arc and smashed her hand down in a fist on top of the alligator's head. She heard the satisfying crunch of bone and felt her hand break through the skull into softer tissue. The gator spasmed a couple times, its tail lashing out one last time, and it fell silent. Birds were shrieking and flying off in shock and protest at the violence that had just erupted. Ursula was soaked, but she didn't care about that one bit. She looked down at the gator to judge its size. It was around 13 feet long nose to tail, and was definitely the biggest she had caught alone. What she had just killed could potentially do serious damage to her, or in particular some of the younger adolescents of her tribe. She dropped down in the river, dragging the gator's carcass behind her, and swam to an easier exit point on the riverbank. With her presence now compromised, there was no need to drag herself through the thorny bush again, and dragging a 700-pound gator would have been an impossibility. Once on the riverbank, she dragged the gator's body into the tree line. She gave a call to her eldest daughter, who had been hidden nearby, watching, and then went back and began covering up her tracks. There was no need to bring unwanted attention, so masking the trail you left was a vital survival strategy she had been made to employ as a youngster. Now, it was just second nature, and any footprints left behind, still visible, were an affront to her pride. Riverbanks were especially notorious for leaving deep tracks, and could easily be spotted from a distance, so always got her special attention. Once satisfied, she picked up the gator carcass and heaved it onto her shoulders. She then walked off into the forest, leaving behind nothing to say they'd ever been there except ruffled feathers of a few birds, already settling back into their daily routines. The family greeted their arrival with the usual hoots and hollers as they walked into the cave they shared. She threw the carcass of the dead gator onto the floor of the cave, and there was a burst of squeals and loud chatter in excitement of their meal to come. She stepped back and waited for the alpha, Uruk, to take his portion. As alpha female, she was second to claim hers. She much preferred the tail meat and ripped off a sizable chunk. The rest swarmed over the body and began disassembling it into pieces for eating. These were typically noisy and boisterous occasions, where the young members of the group would fight over the prize pieces. As a rule, the eldest and biggest usually got the best choice of meat, but some of the faster and more nimble youngsters could steal prize morsels, causing much frustration and anger in their elders. Eyeballs were small, tasty morsels, but always caused the biggest fights. Her daughter had been fly, in already removing one of them before entering the cave. A mature male who had hoped to claim the eyeball shot her daughter an accusing, suspicious look, at which point her daughter suddenly found something under one of the fingernails that was of extreme interest. As she chewed on the raw meat, she scanned the group to ensure the youngest were allowed their share. As the matriarch of the group, it was her responsibility to ensure the weakest members got to eat. There was plenty to go around, and would last a couple of days. By the end, the bones would be picked clean, after the marrow had been extracted. A week later, Ursula and Uruk had formed a hunting party. There were 7 strong, and made up mostly of mature adults. 2 of the older adolescents were allowed to accompany them on the trip. The hunt would take place to the west of their cave, where the deer had congregated. It was hilly ground that was rich in deciduous trees, with tasty leaves that they ate. Wild berries had also come into season, which had attracted all sorts of animals. As with any hunting trip, there was always young stragglers that would tag along uninvited. Their presence was permitted as long as they hung back to a respectable distance. They lacked the strength and stamina to keep up with the hunting party and could get hurt. Knowing how to read their quarry and remain unseen was an art that took years to learn. Plus, there were the tools used in catching them that only came equipped with maturity. It wouldn't be the first time these stragglers had ruined a hunt by alerting the prey to their presence. A lesson Uruk would ensure would be taught and remain in their memories for years to come. They had all done the same when they had been young. They had all had taken a beating when they messed up. Watching was, however, the only way to learn. 10 miles west of the cave, they crested one of the forested foothills. In the valley below was a herd of black-tailed deer. They were gorging on wild berries as well as acorns that had recently fallen. This was an essential part of their diet, along with leaves and buds, for building up fat reserves which would help see them through the winter. Their scent had carried across, betraying their location. These were highly alert animals, so the troop moved as stealthily as possible, keeping the wind in their faces. There were trails in the hills the deer followed. The troop ensured they kept their own trails higher up and began to spread out. Uruk led 2 of the larger males northwards to set up an ambush. Ulsa and 2 of the adolescents headed to the south end and cut across the deer trail. She instructed the adolescents to cover the western flank of the valley, leaving the lone male covering up the slope they had just left. It was Ulsa's job to send the herd ahead of her, with the adolescents and lone male making up enough noise to discourage any retreat up the slopes. They had to get into position without spooking the deer, which was the first stage of the hunt. Once the adolescent hit the western slope, the wind would carry her scent to the deer, alerting them of their presence. They all needed to act as one to ensure the deer would follow the right path. Ulsa watched the western flank carefully. She had to judge wind speed and direction and time it just right. She made the first tree knock, and instantly the deer's ears pricked up and looked down in her direction. The knock was answered to her east, which confused the deer and began to make them uneasy. A minute later, the wind had carried the scent of the western troop members, who had now made it up the slope. She struck again, 3 times. The sound was immediately answered to her east, and the deer began running north in panic. As soon as they were on the move, the 3 members began chasing them after making no attempt at keeping quiet. Hoots and hollers could be heard from each of them as they gave chase in excitement. Up ahead, the 3 large males directed their attention to the deer running straight at them. Uruk singled out an old male and blasted him with a roar as he sprung up in its intended path. The roar was made up of a random sound of frequencies ranging from high to low. The effect was designed to resonate with the internal organs of the deer, which could cause a stunning effect, increasing their chances of catching their prey. The 2 other males targeted a younger female and followed his example. Both deer visibly flinched at the sound waves blasted at them. Uruk surged forward, breaking into a sprint, still roaring at the stag. Panic ensued with the deer running in all directions. Ulsa almost snatched one as they doubled back the way they had come. She roared at another doe, which stunned it enough to make it trip on the underbrush. She snatched its rear legs and managed to keep hold of it as it struggled in vain. Death came quickly as its head was twisted violently, breaking its neck. Ulsa looked up, breathing hard. Uruk had managed to catch the large male stag, and the other 2 males had missed taking down the younger doe. The hunt had been a huge success. Catching 2 deer was a huge bonus and a great learning curve for the youngsters. It wasn't long before they were all surrounded by excited adolescents full of glee at their success. On the way back to the camp at the cave, they would run ahead reenacting the hunt, showing off their prowess. Ulsa brought up the rear, making sure there were no obvious tracks to follow leading back to their camp. One of her daughters had joined her and helped in the task. Most of the days were spent collecting food. They would move from area to area looking for vegetation to eat, which formed 80% of their diet. Meat was always a bonus and meant longer rest periods between meals. Wild fruits, nuts, and seeds would provide vital vitamins that supplemented their diet. Some of them could specialize in other areas such as catching fish if they had the patience. Success always improved when they were able to fashion tools or strategies. They were careful not to exhaust the food supply in any one area. They never stripped a plant of all of its vegetation or took more than they could eat. By far, the easiest meals came to them from visiting the humans. They had a rather shocking inability to survive without wearing the skin of other animals or huddling by a fire to keep warm. They would hole up in their hand-built caves and spend days at a time without leaving. They were alarmingly intelligent and curious, but extremely ignorant, small, and fragile. They would take over vast swaths of land, clearing away trees, and then replacing them with fields of crops of their choosing. They had domesticated animals, and would protect them fiercely. They had also proven to be extremely destructive, and by far the biggest threat to Ulsa's tribe. If you killed one, many would come seeking revenge. If you took one, many would come looking, and if their paths crossed by accident, they would freak out and go get their guns and their dogs. The gun was what they feared the most. It had killed some of them in the past. Her father had caught one on its own in the woods once. It wasn't much of a threat, as it had no weapon. He had removed the animal's skin to see if the rumors were true, and the thing could not survive without it. The small male had died a short time later. His teeth were chattering and he was so cold. He had gone into shock. Ulsa had watched from a safe distance and had felt sorry for it. Her father did not think it would have died and had been wrong. The price they paid for that encounter had been a disaster. When the humans had come looking and found the body, they had gone mad with rage. Their hunting parties had scoured the woods looking for the killer, and the family had to flee the area. One of her younger brothers had run to a tree and climbed it in panic, hoping to hide from the hunters. They mercilessly shot and killed him. They were dragging his body away when her father had intervened. His rage at killing his son was a frightening sight. They tried to defend themselves with their guns. Despite being shot multiple times, he still managed to kill them and rescue her brother's body, but did not survive his wounds. He had later died in agony. The death of her father had meant losing his protection. The implications had been huge. His size and intelligence commanded the other tribes' fear and respect. With him gone, some of the alphas from the other tribes had come into their territory, subjugating the males and taking the younger females for breeding. Some of the mature males had fought back and paid the price with broken bones, crippling them. One had died from a fractured skull. Ulsa and what remained of her tribe had fled to another tribe whose alpha had been first cousin to her father. Her father's noble blood flowed in his veins. He and his matriarch took pity on them and gave them shelter. They were safe under his protection. The matriarch had helped her father with Ulsa and her siblings after her mother had died in childbirth to her younger brother the hunters had killed. The burden of the extra numbers her tribe had added put a strain on the resources the Alpha's territory could not sustain. They had to revert to stealing from the humans' fast food supplies. Ulsa's pride had been severely hurt. She wanted nothing to do with these creatures. Ultimately, something had to be done. Uruk, being the eldest son of the Alpha, had stepped forward. He claimed Ulsa for his own, and took in her family under his protection. Some of his male relatives joined them, and together they reclaimed her father's territory. It had taken years to get this family back to some sort of strength, but was finally turning a corner. Ulsa was determined that her family would survive. She would do whatever it took to ensure that they did. She was her father's daughter, and now this family's matriarch. With Uruk's great strength and her determination, surviving and thriving was now becoming a reality. As Ulsa sat contently in the sun, her hand had moved to her belly. She had felt new life growing there. If she reached full term, this would be her 8th child to Uruk. 3 daughters and 1 son was all that had survived their ordeal on claiming back their rightful territory. Her firstborn had been a son. He had been attacked by a pack of coyotes that had boldly assailed the juveniles that were charged with babysitting him. The attack had been a direct challenge to laying claim on their territory. Ulsa had been with Uruk in a hunting party at the time. They had been miles away from the scene of the attack. When the alarm calls had finally reached them, they had returned too late. Her son had his throat torn out and drowned on his own blood. The coyotes had fled before they had returned. Uruk's wrath was terrible. He hunted down those coyotes and killed their alpha. He found their nursing den and destroyed their pups. The rest had fled their territory and were now out of reach. The coyote alpha's skull still decorated their cave wall. She had lost the second in her womb. It was a massive blow, and it made her feel that they were doomed to wither and die. Giving birth to a pitiful stillborn had been heartbreaking. She buried him in a sacred place next to her older brother. Her father had shown her for their family. She had gone into a depression afterwards, and that had lasted for months. It was only when she had felt her eldest daughter growing within her that her resolve had returned, and her path once again made clear. The third that died had been her 5th born, who had caught pneumonia. She lay at peace beside her brothers and grandparents. Her last few years had settled with the grip, becoming more firm and secure on the land she loved. She had hoped that this one now growing within her would be another son. Females were, by far, more valuable to any tribe, but having males gave security, which she felt they needed. She also wanted her eldest son to have brothers, so they could protect and continue their blood lineage. Uruk was an attentive father, but could be a little rough with the infants. He much preferred them when they were older, and they were stronger and could fight back a little. She was sure to join in and help the little ones turn the tables on their father. She could fight dirty with the best of them, and felt this needed to be taught to her children. Uruk would end up engulfing them in his arms and gave them a bear hug until their squeals satisfied his belief that he was in charge and he had won. As soon as he'd let go, they would all pretend to whimper in defeat. He would turn around to walk away, only to be assailed from behind, and before he could react, they would flee. The other females would watch and shout encouragement. Then they would close ranks, protecting the children behind them. Uruk would walk away with his nose in the air, pretending to be hurt. He would hide and then ambush an unsuspecting child who knew perfectly well where he was and couldn't resist the temptation. This play was infectious. The whole family would get involved in this activity, which only strengthened the bonds between them all. Full stomachs meant good humor. The alarm call was sounded. Uruk immediately moved to respond. 4 mature males and 1 female went with him. The Coyotes had returned with a new alpha leading their group. They were raiding the area and hoping for an easy meal. 3 members had seen them enter their territory and raise the alarm. Ulsa decided to stay back and protect the young. Her presence with the other females would deter any attacks that managed to slip past Uruk, which she had slightly doubted would happen. She was absolute in her determination. Nothing would ever threaten her young again. Judging by the yelps and the screams in the distance, the Coyotes were taking a beating. Another alarm call came in. Some of the other males were off to the east, in the opposite direction of the Coyotes. They were so far unaware of the drama unfolding. One had retreated back to within earshot. The alarm meant only one thing: humans. Ulsa felt dread inside at this turn of events. She was stuck between a rock and a hard place. She was frightened that the human hunters would shoot members of her family. What terrified her more was Uruk befalling the same fate as her father. She didn't want to leave the young ones defenseless either. She decided that she would go and meet this new threat on her own. It was potentially far deadlier than the Coyotes' raid into their own territory. The thought of losing Uruk to these humans' guns again filled her mind. He would challenge them directly, bringing his strength to bear on them. Their recourse would be to defend themselves and open fire. Uruk was every bit as strong and tough as her father had been, but this had not saved him in the end. There was just as much at stake. Besides, there was no real way of knowing what the humans were doing. They may have simply been on a hunting trip of their own and wandered into her and Uruk's territory unwittingly. Uruk had managed to kill one of the beta males from the Coyotes' pack. Its yelps and squeals, as he had broken its neck, had let the other Coyotes know Uruk meant business. He would not allow these vermin to claim a foothold in his territory, so close to his family's home. He roared his challenge as the pack scattered to avoid his rage. The other males let out roars of their own as they crashed through the forest in pursuit. Uruk and his pack were 8 strong, all mature adults capable of stunning a 400-pound stag into a complete standstill with their vocal ranges. They could surround and confuse their targets with sound that confused and disoriented them. Certainly long enough for one of them to run and dispatch it without knowing it had even been hit. 2 of the lighter males had raced ahead of Uruk and the others. He heard them bellowing at the Coyotes ahead as he raced to intercept. They fell upon another male subordinate. Death, as always, came quickly and violently for the wretched creature. All it could do was squeal out and let its brethren know it was doomed. Its death cry was cut off suddenly as its head was almost torn from its shoulders. The coyote pack fled back to the western direction they had come from. Their tails were tucked between their legs and ears were laid back flat on their skulls as they ran full speed to escape their pursuers. Their alpha led the way. Uruk chased them long and hard until they were a good few miles from their inner domain. Their territory was too large to police, so they had to settle for driving out undesirables in the proximity of the cave. To extend further would exhaust energies they could not afford, and would leave the young and females exposed. They began returning to the cave. As always, there was an entourage of adolescents following. Tonight they would dine on coyote, which didn't taste all that bad. Nothing went to waste. They were met halfway back by another male. Uruk broke into a run on learning the news of the humans' intrusion. They would have to be dealt with. Ulsa moved into position. The two hunters were making enough noise to scare away everything in their path. It was a wonder these creatures didn't starve to death, she thought. She could smell the stench of alcohol coming from them, which seemed to have given them good humor, at least. They were busy talking to one another, and were completely oblivious to their surroundings. Ulsa picked up a stone and threw it. Their general direction was headed toward Ulsa's home. She needed to get these two turned around somehow. The stone landed 15 meters behind them, making a crashing noise in the underbrush. The two whirled around in response. If she'd been human and understood their language, she would have heard them whispering. "Did you hear that, Ted?" "Yeah, sounded like a bear to me, Dave." "How do you know it was a bear?" Dave asked. "I could smell it," he hissed. "Bullshit. I can't smell a damn thing," Dave said. "Well, that ain't a surprise. You drank half that bottle of whiskey, you damn drunk," accused Ted. "I ain't a drunk. I can handle my whiskey, unlike you, you damn lightweight," Dave shot back. Ted immediately shot back. "Will you shut up? We need to kill this damn bear." With that, they both shut up and began edging back the way they had come, toward the noise. They spread out, so they weren't such an easy target. Guns at the ready. Ulsa threw another stone further this time, over the hunters' heads. The noise it made had these two idiots bristling with tension. If a mouse had run in front of them, they probably would have tried to shoot it. She could have easily ran down and ended their lives before they could react. They were like children, venturing into the woods for the first time. Ulsa gave this idea some consideration. She thought about her father and what had happened when the humans had found their dead skin. The thought of another group of these things armed to the teeth scouring the woods gave a chill up and down her spine. Discretion was in this case the better part of valor. Instead of launching a physical attack, she chose to zap them instead with some sonic bursts. She lacked these humans' ability to modulate sounds the way they did, but she could reach a much higher ultrasonic level, as well as lower infrasonic levels, sound frequencies that were beyond these humans' hearing range. Some of these abilities, particularly the infrasound, only came with maturity. Lung capacity played a significant role in achieving these levels that younger members couldn't quite reach. They simply lacked the size. Instead of random frequencies, she stuck with a single ranged burst at a low hertz range. A couple of mature males who were watching what was going on added to the effect by vocalizing in the ultrasonic range. The overall effect was stunning. Neither of the human males could hear what was going on, but they could feel it. Ted and Dave's hairs on the back of their necks stood on end. The forest had gone deadly quiet, and the feeling of being watched or stalked was heavy in the air. The forest seemed to hold its breath. "I don't like this, Dave," Ted said. "This bear is stalking us." "Yeah, I can feel it. I got a bad feeling about this man. We need to get the hell out of here," Dave told him. "I ain't scared of this goddamn bear," Ted said rather unconvincingly. Dave mentioned he wasn't feeling too good and was beginning to wish he hadn't drank any of that whiskey. They quickened their pace as they began heading back the way they had come. Suddenly, Dave stopped to vomit. His eyes watered and his stomach began to violently empty its contents. Sweat glistened on his brow. "Oh, for God's sake, Dave!" Ted said accusingly. I told you couldn't hold your goddamn liquor. Shut up, Ted. Must have been that bacon we had this morning. Thought it tasted funny. Tasted fine to me, Ted muttered. Ulsa honed in at around 9 to 10 hertz and cranked up the intensity on poor Dave. As Dave was kneeling over his pile of vomit, his eyes went wide and his bowels gave a rather violent twinge. He did not recall ever feeling a twinge like this before. He tried to stand up, but wasn't quick enough. He looked at Ted with a mortified look on his face. Ted, who was disgusted at Dave's weakness, looked at him with contempt. He was just about to tell Dave to get up and stop being a wimp when he noticed Dave's expression change and suddenly get to his feet. Clearly alarmed, he assumed Dave had seen something and whirled around expecting an attack. When nothing came, he looked back at Dave and was about to ask what was wrong when he caught that first whiff. "Oh my God," he said as he brought his hand up to cover his nose. "Have you shit yourself?" Dave just looked at him and nodded. I want to go home," Dave said. "For God's sake, Dave, what the hell, man? Sweet Jesus, you stank!" Ted shot at him. For the moment, the bear had been forgotten. "Let's get the hell out of here. I doubt that bear would want to eat you now." Dave began walking forward, albeit a little woodenly. The feeling of the load in his pants was discouraging from him wanting to bend his knees too much. You won't tell anyone, will you, Ted?" Dave asked. "No, course I won't," Ted replied. The broad smile breaking across his face didn't fill Dave with a lot of confidence. My wife's gonna kill me," Dave said. "What should I tell her?" "Just say you slipped on a pile of bear shit. There's a river back there where we camped. You can wash yourself there. There's no way you're getting in my car smelling like that," Ted told him. Ulsa and the two males tracked them back to their camp. They did not reveal themselves or conduct any more attacks. Ulsa felt satisfied the threat had been dealt with and gave the signal for them to return to camp. As she was turning back, she was suddenly aware of Uruk's presence. He had been watching her from a discreet distance. She wasn't sure how long he had been watching, but he had an unhappy look on his face. He stared her down, and she dropped her gaze to look at her feet. She shuffled uncomfortably and began examining a bit of dirt under her nail. Uruk stuck his nose into the air and turned as he began walking back to camp. With his gaze no longer boring into her, Ulsa studied his gait. He could pretend to be mad all he wanted. She could see his shoulders rolling as he walked. She too began laughing without making any sound. The look on that poor human's face as he filled his pants had been priceless. A few weeks later, they broke camp. It was time to move to their winter feeding grounds. The vegetation would be drastically reduced in their diet as winter settled. Meat would become their main food intake, which meant following the migration of deer. Many more challenges would present themselves to Uruk and Ulsa. They had proved that these challenges could be overcome. Her intelligence and his great strength would lead their family onwards, facing those challenges together. Her memory would serve them well on where to find food in this great territory they inhabited. Her instincts seldom let them down, and her love would keep them together always. She was their matriarch.